Welcome everyone to the Michigan Historic Preservation Network July webinar. Today, we're very excited to have our two speakers, Erica and Ron, to talk about an accessible future for presentation. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items about Zoom. If you have any questions, please type them into the Q&A box as you think of them. All the questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And if you don't see the Q&A box, it should be at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you still don't see it, please wiggle your mouse. And if you have any thoughts and resources that you would like to share, please feel free to use the chat box. And please participate in the survey after this webinar concludes. If this is your first time attending our webinar, we are the Michigan Historic Preservation Network. We advocate for Michigan's historic places to contribute to our economic vitality, sense of place, and connection to the past. We could not do the work we do without our members and volunteers. So if you are not a member yet, please consider joining us at www.mhpn.org. This webinar is supported in part by an award from the Michigan Arts and Culture Council. And it is my great pleasure today to introduce our speakers to you. First, I will introduce Erica Coulson. Erica is the president of Walk the Line to SCI Recovery, Inc., a physical therapy and occupational therapy clinic, which she co-founded after sustaining a spinal cord injury in 2001. Erica is the board chairwoman for the Don't Just Sit There Foundation. She has also held board member positions with the Brain Injury Association of Michigan and the Coalition Protecting Auto No Fault and Take Root Dance. She is a current advisor to the USA Transportation Security Authority, Disability and Multicultural Coalition, and Little Caesars Arena, Detroit, Disability Advisory Committee during stadium design. In 2013, Erica won the top recognition and highest honor in the Oakland County Elite 40 Under 40 program. She was the first female to be selected as top 40 under 40 entrepreneur and the only person with disability to date. And our second speaker is Ron Campbell. Ron is a principal planner and preservation architect for Oakland County Planning and Economic Development Services. He provides design and technical assistance for Oakland County's 25 Main Street communities and preservation assistance for historic structures and sites in all of Oakland County's 62 multiple units of government. Prior to joining the county in 2006, he was a senior partner in a successful architectural and engineering firm where he was a project manager and director of design and marketing. His work has received international, national, and local design and preservation recognition on a wide range of building types and planning projects. Ron is a former MHPN board member, serving terms since 1981 through 2021. He was recently reappointed to serve a second term on the Michigan Barrier-Free Design Board. He has served on the leadership committee of the National Main Street Center Architects Representative on the Main Street Coordinators Board, Local DDA Board, and AIA Michigan Executive Committee. He has authored numerous articles and presentations on preservation. He is also co-author of Michigan's designation depots, lighthouses along the rivers of steel. With that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Erica and Ron. And please go ahead and share your screen.
Great, thank you for that intro. Let me do that now. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. Thank you for having us, Ron and I, to speak to you today. And I know we want to thank MHPN for hosting this webinar in such an important month. July is Disability Pride Month. And yesterday was actually the 33rd anniversary of the signing of the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990. So it's a very timely, and I know not coincidental, presentation to be having. It's a time when we can not only recognize the history of people with disabilities, celebrate the triumphs of the past, and also discuss barriers that exist going forward. This is Ron and I, and it was a great intro. So thank you for that. We'll take some questions at the end. Before we move really forward into talking about disability, wanted to share with you a little bit of my own history. And I love this photo because I really feel like, you know, after almost 22 years of being spinal cord injured, this is something that really rings true for me, and I've learned this in dealing with whether it's medical professionals, just everyday society, or kind of my own mental self-talk. But I was injured in 2001. I was 23 and sustained a spinal cord injury in that automobile accident. Since then, I've used a wheelchair, sometimes a power wheelchair, sometimes a manual wheelchair. Both kind of afford me a different perspective on society and different abilities of my own, things that I can perform independently. But what I think most about when I talk about my injury and the time since then is that I do, even though it's been so long, I do recall what it was like being able-bodied and being able to move so freely throughout society, from place to place, destination to destination, and not really have to think too much about what was going to happen when I got to that store, or what was I going to do if I was out all day, or where was I going to park. And these are things that, as a person with a disability that uses a mobility device, I think about constantly now. And so it does afford a different perspective. Now, one could say that it's an unfortunate perspective, but I also think, according to this slide, that I think you can also see it as an opportunity to make lasting change in our communities and the places where we live and work and hang out, to be a better place for everyone, to be more accessible, to be more inclusive, things like that. I do co-own Walk the Line with my parents and my husband. We started it in 2007 to be a place of recovery and hope for people with spinal cord injuries, brain injuries, and other neurological impairments. And we've proudly been in business and in Oakland County since 2007. So we're very proud of that. I have been an advocate for the preservation of our auto no-fault system for many, many, many years. Unfortunately, that system was drastically changed forever in 2019. But through that advocacy work, I've seen the power of education, advocacy, and working together with community groups to try and create lasting change. I also worked with the city of Birmingham to identify and improve their downtown parking to be in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act and to better serve the community. And I've also worked with Oakland County, which is how I had the good fortune of meeting Ron and his team in developing the small business accessibility initiative, essentially looking at ways that we can help small businesses identify and remedy their own barriers. So I do think that as part of that educational process on disability, it's important to kind of start with the basics and to really understand what people with disabilities have gone through historically over time, and how we can learn to create a better community for everyone. So what is a disability? A disability is essentially a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activities of that individual. Interestingly, 1 in 4, now they say, Americans will experience disability in their lifetime. I heard this the other day on a podcast I was listening to, but essentially everyone is temporarily able-bodied until either old age or something else happens. And so it's important that we understand the experience of people with disabilities, but also understanding that disability isn't just about the physical or mental impairment. It's also about that lived experience of the individual. Again, how we are able to access equally and freely things like transportation, healthcare, jobs, our communities, education. These are systemic barriers that people with disabilities have faced for hundreds, if not thousands of years. And it's important that we identify them so that we can learn to move past them. So how do we talk to someone with a disability? There are 2 different kind of schools of thought, and I think it's really great that the disability community is having these discussions. Several years ago, it became popular to use person first language, which is putting the person first, followed by the identity. Example, person with a spinal cord injury, a person with a disability. In more recent years, identity first language has come to favor also, which is putting the identity first. So a spinal cord injured person, a disabled person. Really the rationale here is that but you cannot talk about me, or I cannot talk about myself without identifying as a spinal cord injured person. And so either is okay, both are acceptable, and some people may have preferences more so than the other. And the most important thing is that you understand the difference and ask the questions. For some reason, it's not letting me move forward. Here we go. There are no real no-nos. There are some real no-nos, excuse me, such as handicapped, calling someone wheelchair bound, or referring to someone as their mobility equipment. And I know this may seem like, who would do that? But people do that. And I have been referred to as the wheelchair more times than I care to recall. So, it's very important to give people the respect and the dignity of identifying them as the person and individual that they are. And if you're not sure what to do, it's always okay to just ask. So it's important to understand that prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act in 1990, people with disabilities were institutionalized, marginalized, discriminated against, made fun of, literally hidden out of sight. And this has led to a lot of the systemic problems that we are now dealing with, even in the wake of the ADA, 33 years later. We still deal with many of these issues. Now, things like institutionalization, discrimination, those things are all illegal per the ADA, but they still occur. And as we'll talk more about, there's still difficulties in accessing our communities and the other things that we talked about: transportation, education, healthcare, jobs. In the 1970s and 80s, this was really the height of the disability advocacy, the disability movement. There were things like the Section 504 protests, the Gang of 19 in 1978 in Denver, and then the Capitol Crawl, in Washington, D.C. in 1990. So in 1973, Section 504 of the Rehab Act was passed, and we have the wording there. It essentially said that there could be no discrimination for people with disabilities under federal programs or programs using federal funds. Unfortunately, I guess fortunately, what this represented for the disabled community was a shift in our own thinking. So prior to this, the idea of, let's say, being able to not go to college. Like, I would like to go to college, but colleges aren't accessible to me. And that's my fault because I have the disability. Section 504 essentially turned this conversation around and said it's actually the fault of the institution of the university, not the fault of the individual. And the university is responsible for remedying that situation so that all persons can attend universities or public institutions. So it really turned things around, not only from a society perspective, started that process, but I think also for disabled advocates as well. Now, unfortunately, between 1973 and 1977, there was no definition set of what a disability was. And in order for the law to go into effect, that had to happen. So this wonderful woman you see at the front of the picture here, Judy Heumann, she's often viewed as the mother of the disabled rights movement. Judy and her friends staged a massive sit-in in 1977 at a federal building in San Francisco. And these brave 26 individuals took over this federal building, occupied it, shut it down, and essentially held the government hostage until they decided to define people what disability meant. And once that happened, later in 1977, then Section 504 was able to go into effect. Now, unfortunately, Section 504 was not very effective, but it really laid the groundwork for not only future advocacy efforts, like those individuals in Denver who were demanding equal access to transportation, or like the Capitol Crawl, those individuals that participated in that protest in Washington, D.C., that really pushed the ADA forward. So we have them to thank for that, and Judy to thank for that. Judy was affected with polio when she was an infant and was a wheelchair user her whole life after that. She was denied access to school at an early age because she was seen as a fire hazard and her school was not wheelchair accessible. And this was a pattern that happened to her through her whole life as she went on to gain even higher education and became a teacher herself. She was also denied a job in a school based on that same reason. So Judy fought the remainder of her life as an advocate and was a critical component to all of the freedoms and the other things that people with disabilities are afforded today. She has an excellent biography called Being Human, and she's also, her life story is featured in a movie called Crip Camp. Both of those things are highly recommended for anybody looking for a little bit more information. And really all of these things are, to say that the intent of the barrier-free codes that we'll discuss and the ADA laws to allow everyone to have the same experience, to be able to move through society, through all aspects of our community with that same level of experience and freedoms that everyone else does. Accessibility is, again, being able to access all of those things freely, to not have to think ahead about your ability to enter a building, access a space, use a bathroom, where are you going to park? All of those things are aspects of being involved in society that one has to think about before going out. But as we've talked about, and as you'll continue to learn, it's not about special privileges or about ramps and curb cuts or accommodations. Accessibility is really an issue of equality and being seen as a group of people and as individuals that should be afforded the same rights and freedoms as everyone else in this country. And the great thing is accessibility benefits everyone. It's great for families, it's great for children, it's great for the elderly. Just about everyone benefits from universal design that also provides equal access. And it's the right thing to do, of course. Why should you care? As I said, now the most recent study I read said 1 in 4 people is estimated as having at least one disability in the United States. 35% of this population is of working age and earns an income through employment or supplemental support and benefits. The total disposable income for US adults with disabilities is about $490 billion. This is comparable to other significant market segments, and our discretionary income for working age people with disabilities is about $21 billion, which is greater than other market segments like African Americans or the Hispanic population combined. People with disabilities and their families are loyal to companies that provide access and accommodations. And I know this to be true for myself and my family. You know, in my local communities that we frequent, I know all of the places to go. I know all of the businesses that are accessible. I know the places that have good bathrooms that I can use. And my family and I frequent those businesses often. And we tell all of our friends about it too. And I think this is really important because, you know, big box stores that are new and popping up all over, they have an easier time being accessible because they're new and it's mandated under the law. And so it's easy for them to build these places that are so easy to go, but have little character and don't afford you the benefit of that one-on-one small business interaction. So in order for historic communities and small businesses to really stay viable in the future, having this conversation and figuring out how to improve accessibility is so important. Local economies thrive when public and private entities are inclusive to the disabled community. And hiring people with disabilities to be more inclusive is difficult to do if your business isn't accessible. Oh, sorry, Ron, this is your slide.
No,
Let me know.
fine. You're going to flip them right as we go.
Okay, I will.
Well, you mentioned that it's universal accessibility is more than just curb cuts, but I'm going to start with curb cuts because that was one of the first cities it was the first city in the United States, was Kalamazoo, to install curb cuts. And this was at the urging of a World War II veteran, disabled Navy man that came back to his hometown. And he was having to use driveways to navigate his path from home to his office. He was an attorney in Kalamazoo, and he thought this is silly for having to use driveways to that I could walk the sidewalk. And if we had something at the intersections that would allow me, I could have the same path as I would if I was walking. So Kalamazoo, 1945, was the first ones to introduce curb cuts. Okay. We'll just hit some of these real quick.
You want me to keep going?
Sure,
Ron?
go, and I'll stop. Yeah, we'll put them all up there.
Okay.
1961, that was the first really design standards for accessibility. And this was done at the University of Illinois and financed by the Easter Seal Research Foundation. And that became really the first standard that architects and designers had to work with. And again, Michigan jumped to the forefront in 1966 with the Public Act 1 of 1960, which required all state and municipal buildings to have accessibility. It took 2 more years, and then it was the Architectural Barriers Act that was passed, similar act by the federal government. 1970, Erica mentioned Judy Herman and Human, and it was in 1970 she was denied a teaching license. And one quote that it always struck with me was when she said, "Gee, I can be president of the United States with a disability, but I can't teach." And that just rang so true. 1974, I'll jump ahead a little bit. 1974, Michigan Barrier-Free Design Code goes into effect. 1980, ANSI published an accessibility design standards that updated the earlier one. 1990, ADA law. 1991, the standards for that ADA law was published. And again, into 2010, they revised those standards and pretty much have held to that to date. Now, the standards, it was interesting because as we're going to see, there's a difference between ADA and building codes. And they didn't always agree. And as architects, we were always charged with upholding the building code laws, designing to the building code, and not ADA. And so when there was a conflict between the two, we were at a quandary because that would leave our clients susceptible to legal pursuits if you didn't comply with ADA. But if that was in conflict with the building code, what do you do? Well, we brought those under pretty much in sync now. And I don't know of any instances. I've heard that there are, but I haven't heard or haven't encountered any instances where the two don't match up. So let's take a look at the how the two align.
There we go.
So we have Michigan Barrier Free Code on one side, ADA on the other. Now, again, as Erica said, they're both working towards the same intent, but they come at it from different perspectives. Michigan Barrier Free Code is a public act. It's administered by the building code, where ADA is a civil rights violation, nothing to do with building code, but it's a civil rights violation. Okay. Under Barrier Free Code, Michigan's Barrier Free Code is a local building official who will review the plans and construction and accepts or rejects whether that particular design and building meets compliance. On the ADA side, it's enforced by the U.S. Department of Justice and has nothing to do with state or local building officials. Then if you want to appeal the decision by the local building official under Michigan Barrier Free, only the Michigan Barrier Free Design Board, and if necessary, the circuit court can grant exceptions to the law. Whereas under ADA, it's not brought by the local building official, it's brought by the DOJ, and it's actually brought by an individual or organization, as we'll see, that files a complaint that their civil rights have been violated. Now, under Michigan Barrier Free, accessibility is required in all new commercial construction. And it's required for existing buildings that are changing their existing use group. Now, by existing use group, it's not a change in ownership, but it's a change in how that building's used. So let's say, for example, you have a residence, single family residence, and that's going to be changed to maybe an office. Maybe it's going to be a attorney's office or well, whatever. That is a change in use in the eyes of the building code. So when that is happens, that existing building of any change of use has to undergo ADA and barrier-free improvements. Under ADA, compliance is required of all buildings, regardless of when they were built. And the only exceptions here are private clubs, such as golf clubs, religious buildings, and private residence. And if you made the improvements back in 1991 when ADA first came in, and those improvements are still existing and you haven't made any other changes, those standards are still in effect and you're still valid under meeting ADA. And this is known as safe harbor. So if you made the changes in 1991 and met those qualities, they're still in effect today. Okay. Now, under Michigan Barrier-Free Code, the process begins with local building officials, as I mentioned, and they are the ones that determine whether the plans and construction meets the requirements of the building code. With ADA, that begins with a private individual or an organization who files a complaint of discrimination with the Department of Justice. And I want to point out again, receiving approvals and a certificate of occupancy by the local building official does not mean that you are meeting ADA. Now, hopefully you are, but it doesn't guarantee it. So under ADA, the DOJ, Department of Justice, determines if a person's civil rights have been violated. And if there is sufficient evidence that the DOJ finds, they can bring lawsuits against that person accused of it. Now, I went through and I found some common violations of ADA, and you can see them here on the left, the ramps, restrooms, parking, signage. They weren't put in any certain order, but Oakland County, we surveyed something like 35,000 businesses in Oakland County. And of those, these were the questions and the ranking that our businesses gave as to what they felt was in violation. Ramps topped the list. 35% said it was ramps that were incorrect or lack of. Restroom facilities, 24% said inaccessible or located in a building where it's not accessible and or the equipment. Parking was another big one, 13%. Signage, and one that we didn't expect, and that was uninformed staff. Now, we didn't have any that was uninformed. This didn't come up in our survey, but you can see how they line up, that probably in your own town and maybe your own business, these are kind of ranked in order that what you can expect to find. So then our question was, and you can go through on this too, Erica, and list them all. Well, why are these not accessibility improvements? Why aren't they being done? Well, 49%, almost half the people said that they believe their building was accessible and was in fine condition. 28% said, well, I only lease a space. I'm not responsible for these types of improvements. I thought this would have been higher. The cost was number 3 at 8.5%. I have always been led to believe that it was a cost that was holding people back, but it didn't prove to be true. 3.6%, well, we're just not aware of what's needed. And just under 2% said that it was building or site limitations that held them from making these improvements. Number 6 was 8.2%, but this included things like, well, we're a home business, we're e-commerce, we recently purchased. And the one that really caught my attention was historic buildings. I'm a historic building, therefore I don't have to be barrier-free accessible. So we're going to create some opportunities out of obstacles, as you'll see. We hope anyway. I think one of the Erica's taught me so much. She's brought me more aware of accessibility than I ever was before. It's been great working with her. And we went out one snowy morning and we did a little tour of different communities. And these are some very common types of buildings that you find in our older sections of downtowns. The door entries are recessed and they're single width. So very difficult to get in and get out. Whereas a door in the left, you can see where that's brought out to the street. Opportunity for accessibility, but what's there? A high curb, a high stoop. So impossible to get into this building. Okay. Jump in anytime you want, Erica. So
yeah, this is one of my favorites because this and one we don't have in here is when they push the snow all the way into the corner of the accessible parking spot. But snow, can definitely be a big obstacle. And when it comes to removal or moving of snow, you often find situations like this where ramps, pedestrian walkways, things like that can be blocked or partially blocked by snow.
And it's not, they made an obstacle, they made it into an opportunity to get people across the street, but it's a seasonal thing and it has to be operational in all seasons. And simple things like this, a snow removal, can make a big difference. This was another one of our communities, and we just completed a streetscape here. And oftentimes we forget about little things that we could do. When we're putting in new sidewalks and streetscapes, we'll concentrate on the vegetation and what the streetlights are going to look like and things like that. And with some very simple changes here, we've could have made 3-4 businesses along here accessible. And this is one where they used their storefront to create an accessible disabled access ramp, and they were still open for the stairs and everything else, but they took their storefront and used it to create accessibility for everyone.
Yeah, and this is one that this change is relatively recent, as you can tell from the coloring of the steps and the ramp out in front. But also, actually, the sidewalk in front of this is relatively recent as well. And unfortunately, this was not a situation where this particular community took place in making businesses along this same entryway accessible. There are several others farther down. There's a couple that have done it on their own and then several others that have not done it. So I think this community also kind of missed the opportunity there, as did the previous, to work with the building owners and the business owners to create a more seamless and a more accessible business opportunity.
This was another community, and this was a situation that had existed for many, many years. These buildings are built right out to the property line, as often is the case in downtown situation. And so the property owners, the private property owners' rights ended at that storefront. Everything else from there to the street was public access. And, this is what Erica is referring to, and that's how you sometimes just have to work with the city or the municipality and the store owner, property owner, to solve a problem. Not only did we have a step there at the yellow line that you see, but also there was a curb that brought you up to the storefront. So if you could get over one, you still had encountered another one. And I thought the creation, a very creative solution here. They simply worked with the city. They made a cut in that first step, brought it up slightly to a landing. Then you turned and you had another small ramp that went up, another landing that was also accessible from a step. And finally made that final hurdle into the storefront with another slight rise. So very creative solution, I thought, to otherwise difficult. But this never would have happened had it not been for the cooperation between the property owner and the municipality. Sometimes, and Erica pointed this out to me, she said, why in the world would you go to all that effort and time putting that tape down? Probably have to replace it every so often when it could have just been shaved or a little ramp added. And things like this are so simple that it becomes a trip hazard, but it also becomes a barrier. And there are solutions to things like this that can be very simple. I think the next one will fly in, Erica.
Yeah, and I think too, it's difficult to see in this photo, but the actual entrance to this business is recessed. And so it would have been extremely easy for them to just kind of smooth this entryway out, open up the front if they chose to, and really not just make their business more accessible, but also just a little bit more, I think, visible to the community and people traveling by. So again, kind of a missed opportunity here and some wasted time, although I'm not sure that tape was really replaced very often.
but a little small abrupt changes like this can be easily handled. One thing Eric was pointing out to me also was, you look at the accessibility and you don't have latch side clearance when you've got all these obstructions. If you could even get into this recessed entry, you've got a lot of furniture and display items that are creating their own barriers. So
Yeah.
now you have these recess entries and it gets very expensive if you're going to broaden this entry and have the latch side of clearance. This allows a person in a wheelchair to come up and be able to open the door. But again, technology is on our side and we're making these improvements all the time. And they have these barrier-free accessed openings now for several years or many years they've had these. I think that's in the, it'll pop in here, Erica, if you'll switch.
Got it.
And what I like about these is when they first came out, they were battery operated and they were constantly, batteries were draining themselves. Now they have these battery operated, but every time a manual use of that door occurs, that battery recharges itself. So it's very infrequent that the batteries run down. And these are not expensive.
Yeah, and I believe that there were several, they may have been owned by the same landlord, but there were several of storefronts that had a similar look as this, where they had, you know, made the effort of removing the step. The ramp is obviously a little steeper than you would like, and as Ron pointed out, just the door kind of swinging in the opposite direction. This is a business that I thought was interesting to highlight because a lot of our examples focused on exterior accessibility, which is, I think, where everyone's kind of mind immediately goes, unless you're thinking about bathrooms or something interior steps and things like that. But interior accessibility, the ability once you're inside to be able to maneuver your wheelchair, your device, or yourself around free of obstruction. And this is often difficult to do, especially in downtown communities, because the spaces tend to be a little bit smaller. And as you can see with this business, which has done it pretty successfully, there's a lot of stuff that is being put into the as displayed for, either to look at or to purchase. So this was a local business that I went into. There was a zero entry entrance, so it was easy to get in. And then basically once you entered, you either had to go right or you had to go left. And I don't know if this, so this was the left side, and then on the right side was the exact same kind of like straight shot backwards. And then there were 2 points in front of the glass case that you can see and behind it, where you could kind of cross to one side or the other. It was still difficult to turn, within each aisleway, but it was a great way to make use of the space and to provide access in a store that I really did not expect. And this was another business actually just down from one of the first ones that we looked at with the steps and the ramp, some same community, just a few stores down. This business actually had moved to a bigger location in the same community and chosen to make the interior accessible to provide access. So there's this nice, big, long, wide, gradual ramp going in. The other nice thing that you can kind of tell from this photo is that things are not crammed in. So this business had all of their items kind of spread out. Aisleways were clear. Nice also is I distinctly remember this interaction because the person working in the store came up and asked me if I needed help getting anything down or, accessing anything in the business. So great way to just provide that access. This is one of the changing rooms in that same business. They had several that were smaller, like single, single traditional size. This one was larger, so accommodates a wheelchair, accommodates a stroller, accommodates additional people if you have an attendant with you. So I really appreciated this, and I didn't buy anything, Ron, but I did go in and I tried a couple things on just to make sure it actually would work. So again, focusing on or considering that interior accessibility is really important as well.
I think Ira told me that's your husband. I think he told me that he took you back there. So,
Yeah.
um, so what buildings are exempt from ADA? We mentioned that religious organization, private clubs, single family houses, that type of thing. What buildings are exempt from Michigan Barrier Free? Well, utility buildings, access to limited spaces, single family homes, that type of thing. Okay. I'm going to step it up here.
Mm.
Now, some buildings are exempt, or spaces in buildings are exempt from both ADA and Michigan Building Code for accessibility. And they are, and you can go through these real quick.
Sure.
Special spaces such as air traffic control rooms, press boxes of 300 square feet or less, mechanic rooms, all these type of things, and private residents are exempt from both. But let's talk about historic buildings. Historic properties are not exempt from ADA or the Michigan building codes. Older buildings, including historic buildings, are subject to meeting ADA and Michigan Barrier Free requirements only to the extent they are reasonably achievable. And what does that mean? Well, what is reasonably achievable? And we can start with if it's undue financial hardship. There's kind of a 20% rule that if you're making improvements to an existing building, and let's say it's costing you $10,000 for those improvements, then you shouldn't have to spend any more than 20% of what you're actually investing. If you're putting in 10,000 into your building, it's going to cost you 20,000 to put in an elevator somewhere or more, then that becomes an undue financial hardship. And is oftentimes the reason that people receive a waiver. But for historic buildings, it could mean destruction of historic character, those character defining features that often require a lot of thought as to how we can preserve history in our buildings, preserve them, and also make them totally accessible. Now, historic buildings, they're not exempt, but they do have flexibility, such as a ramp with a 1 to 6 slope, which is much steeper than for new construction. And this is for a maximum of 2 feet, but there are exceptions that are built into this for historic buildings. And ADA also considers preserving historic structures. It's considered to be of national interest and economic benefit. And the thing that you're going to hear, I think, for the next few minutes is conduct an accessibility audit. And this will help you identify what you're starting with, what improvements you need to make, and what you're having to work around. And it gives you a good starting point to begin to make these improvements. So ADA requirements for historic buildings. One is an accessible route, could be a non-public entrance, where this wouldn't be allowed under new buildings, a non-public, let's say, and we'll see some examples of this. It's a service entry that will take you there, as long as it's proper signage to it. They would like access to all public spaces at the entry level. Toilet rooms, if they're provided, then one accessible toilet room must be on an accessible route. They have to be able to get there. Displays and narrative information are properly installed and available. So now the National Park Service, they recommend a 3-step approach. You can go through these real quick too.
Okay.
One is a review of the historic sentiment. What are those features that are defining that historic property? Number 2 is the accessibility. What are the current and required levels of accessibility that's required? This is what an accessibility audit is all about. And then evaluate what are the options within the historic preservation context, and what can you do to identify those? And don't forget that you are stewards of the resource. As a board or as a owner, you're the one that as a steward of this, but solutions should provide the greatest amount of accessibility without threatening or destroying those materials and features that make a property significant. All historic properties are distinguished by their architectural features, and we need to keep those in sight. But what are those features? Let's begin to identify them as one of the first steps in this audit. And to avoid damage to these, well, what are the features that convey this significance? And what kind of modifications would we be proposing? Now, my next slide. Oh, yeah. Okay. Important features to consider. Landscape. And I kind of take these as you approach the building. Landscaping, site features, parking, principal elevations. What's the exterior like? And then principal interior spaces. What are those like? With a checklist, again, these checklists are available online. You can print them off. We have some resources at the end of that will show you what this is. But again, taking that arrival, entrance, and when I say activity on the inside, take them in the order that one would approach the building. And these are just some things, helpful items to have with you. Floor plans, site plans, camera, tape measure, fish scale. Say fish scale. Yeah. If you have any questions, I'll tell you what that's about. And level. Okay. And I think these are the same. So I'm going to skip the first two and jump right to the last one. And just remember, sometimes those small, simple buildings, and those that are similar with little or no change, they may be the most difficult to find solutions to. So don't get discouraged. Consider and evaluate all the different possible solutions for deficiency. And when you take them into account, write what are the pros and cons of let's say it's an elevator that you're looking to install. Well, what are the pros and cons? You could locate it maybe in 3 different areas, but what are the pros and cons of all of those areas? And sometimes a building addition or a program modification is the best option to explore. And by program modification, I mean, are you doing things or does everyone have to go in this room that's not accessible? Well, maybe that tour is conducted outside. And then prioritize all these deficiencies based on need. And you can see the outlook there. I'm kind of stepping up a little bit because I think we're running a tad behind.
I'll go through. Oh, sorry. I'll go
No,
through.
she really wants me to go through. Okay, so and then consult with the SHPO. Do your findings inclusion and work with them right from the beginning because they may have some great suggestions too. Keep these reports on file and review them every few years. This we talked about with the battery operated door assist opening. Technology updates and evolves, and sometimes what seems to be a access that's not possible right now, technology can help improve that. And one of the most important and least expensive things to do is provide this information about your property and what's accessible on your website. And we have Erica to thank for that because I never thought of that. And I think one of the best things that a business or an organization who are dealing with the public can do is do one of these audits. It can be completed by a private consultant organization such as the Disability Network. And there are several regions around the state that all operate on the Disability Network. Sometimes they do these depending on the size. There's a minimum charge or a minor charge, or sometimes they can consult for free. And having a disabled person on the team is always good. And I think a preservation architect, speaking from preservation architect side, I think it's good because they can recognize what the significant features are and maybe some ways that can help you solve that problem. So these are some thoughtful solutions that we've ran across. 2 steps up into a church facility, and you can see a very, I think, suitable ramp on the left. Gave them complete accessibility and probably a power assist on those doors. Those doors look pretty heavy. Other than St. Paul, we I contacted, as Eric and I prepared for the National Main Street Conference, I asked some of my compatriots across the nation And they sent me examples of these. And this is one in St. Paul. Couldn't get the ramp in for the distance needed in the front. So again, this is where being a historic building helped, because it got you accessibility, but it was flexibility that allowed you to take it to a secondary entrance. Little one here in Rochester, and this was a Greek, again, as we were talking about, this is a simple little like 3-room house, and it had a step up to the door. By changing the grade, we were able to bring a platform up and level with the door, and didn't affect the architecture. This one was a streetscape that was done in Linden some time back. And during the streetscape, the attempt was made, and it worked. It made, I think, all 6 of these storefronts accessible for the first time in history. And not too far away, another building, we couldn't get it in the front, but they decided that we could get it into the back service area, and that made these storefronts accessible from that service area.
And I always like to point out the beautiful mural on the side of this building, because I think it really draws you to the accessible entrance, and to notice that it's there, and also the beauty of the building itself. So oftentimes, you know, not really visible in any of these pictures, but the accessible entrance can be like a seedy kind of like dodgy, you know, in the alley, kind of like around the back of the building entrance. And I thought they just did a really beautiful job of making it a nice looking, beautiful thing that caught your eye. So I love that about this one.
And one of the tough ones, this was, again, one of these buildings that are significant, the all sides of it, the front, actually all faces in the courthouse square, built in 1846, 2-story building, courtroom. Well, let's go to the next slide. It shows it pretty clearly. The front in a historic photo here always had these steps from the 1860s on. If you go under the tower, you had these beautiful circular stairs that went up to the courtroom, and the corridor down the middle with offices on either side. So it was a very simple building. Next one shows a courtroom on the upper level. Now, so what we looked at was, well, what changes were made? And we found that in the 1930s, under a WPA project, judge's bench in his desk area there at the courthouse was brought out to make an office for him in the back. And so we were able to grab a little bit of that office to put in an elevator. But how is that going to affect the exterior? We were able to get it on the interior and use one of the offices below. But rather than going up and trying to create a ramp up, we ramped down, and it took us into the basement level. We selected this side of the building because you can see that there's been some changes to this. The second means of egress from the courthouse is right there to the right of the door. It has long pipes that go up. It's almost like an airplane chute. If there was a fire there and you had to get out of the building quick, you'd jump on this canvas, you'd push open doors, jump on this canvas thing, and it would take you on a slide down to the ground. Nobody wanted to test it out after 40, 50 years, 60 years of non-use. But anyway, this gave us accessibility to the entire building through this solution. And then I'll be real quick on this. I know we're running out of time. Accessibility is more than just buildings. Eric taught me this. It has helped out as I took notice and observed how things were being used and captioned what was required in the disabled community. It was much more than just access in terms of ramps and elevators. Everything is covered, and I've learned so much in that. I think we all pass through this, and Erica, this is one thing you've always brought up, that our abilities change over time, and sometimes they're temporary, other times they're more lifelong, and regardless, accessibility is helping all of us. So again, just some visual communications, what to expect. This is one thing that Eric taught me, is what really helps you out is knowing what to expect when you get there. And I would think this would help any business. So we can go through these. I don't know.
Sure, some resources for website design and messaging. Important features to consider, contrast and labeling forms clearly, consistent navigation, simple headings and spacings. This is an example of proper contrast and how really, if you think about it again, it kind of makes it easier for all of us to read. This takes into account color blindness, other visual impairments people may have. This is a good example of how it's just sort of easier to read and navigate option 1 versus option 2. Some, again, just things to consider for website design.
Yep. And I noticed here on PowerPoint, you can click on this and it will review your PowerPoint as to what could be done.
This is an exciting document that Oakland County produced, and it lives on their website as well, but was distributed to all the businesses that were surveyed also in the initial survey Ron mentioned. Basically about using federal tax incentives for your businesses. So this document outlines the federal tax incentives for businesses that are already in place. And oftentimes when I've mentioned this to businesses, for the most part, and I believe, Ron, this was one of our questions in the survey, most of the businesses do not know that these tax incentives exist and whether or not they apply. So the first one is the tax credit. So this is for small businesses with 30 or fewer employees and a total revenue of $1 million or less. Basically says you can take up to a $5,000 tax credit or half of an eligible expense that's up to $10,000, $10,250. And the $10,250 is because there's no credit for the first $250 that you spent. And they can be used to offset the costs of any of these listed reasons. There's also a tax deduction, and this is for businesses of any size to take advantage of. And this says that businesses can take a business expense deduction of up to $15,000 per year for removing barriers in facilities or vehicles. Now, the cool thing is that these tax incentives can be used every year, and they can also be used in combination. And so this third paragraph kind of lays that out. But as an example, if you spent $20,000, let's say on a barrier removal project for your business, then you would receive the tax credit of $5,000. And then you would also receive the deduction, which is basically the total expense. So 20,000 minus 5,000, the credit. And so your total deduction would be the max deduction of $15,000. And so it can, when significant changes are made, it can be a very high incentive for businesses to take advantage of these programs. So again, this is available on the Oakland County website as well.
And Eric,
Do you have anything to add?
just one, and that is this is annually. So you could take them 1 year, do it, and do the same thing the following year on another topic. So again, this is what an audit will help you identify what are the steps I need, and you could break it down to small increments to get where you want to go.
And these are just some, support resources, things like that. So these will be available in the presentation afterwards. And thank you for hanging out with us today, learning about accessibility, learning about historic buildings, and how we can improve access in our local communities.
Thank you, Erica and Ron. Really useful knowledge and good. I mean, I really looked at those examples of the historic buildings, and I do agree that accessibility actually benefits everyone. So we do have some questions that I will
I'm
that
gonna
we
stop my
would
sharing
like to
now.
answer here. Okay, let's start with the first question. Okay, after 33 years, does the American Disabilities Act of 1990 still remain current and work well? Has there been amended over time?
Well, I'll jump in here because I've kind of experience in both ADA as well as the building code. I think it's worked well, and over time it has been strengthened. Um, we were all learning in the beginning, just as we did with historic preservation. Today, we're much stronger than we were 40 or 50 years ago. Things have been worked out. We found out where there were conflicts between the building code and ADA. And there's been strong work on both sides to work together to a common accord so that when an architect designs a building, whether it be new or existing, we're kind of going by the same code all the way along. Erica, you?
Yeah, I think that there have definitely been efforts as recently as just a couple years ago to update and improve the ADA. It has been 33 years, and so significant improvements have been made. I think it's important to recognize significant barriers still exist, and I think that there's always, anytime you're trying to reverse, decades or centuries of systemic discrimination, it's going to carry a high cost. And I think it's our ability to move through that conversation that will help us to improve access to our communities and our society in general over time. Interestingly, I believe it was yesterday on the anniversary of the ADA signing, but the Transportation Secretary, Pete Buttigieg, announced that they would be requiring single aisle planes to have a wheelchair accessible bathroom on board for single aisle planes being built in the next 10 years. So we'll see that change in 12 to 14 years from now. So, it's really important to recognize that, yes, these changes are big and they're expensive and they take time, but also the impact on people like myself is that we can't access a restroom on an airplane for the next 14 years. So, these are things that, oftentimes you don't think about if it's not something that you've had to deal with on your own. So I commend the ADA and its authors and all the people that have revised it since, but there's definitely still a lot of work to be done.
Yeah, thank you. Next question. When the historic building is made accessible, what is the most common detail that's missed? You will recall that at the MHPN conference in Holly, the circle drive was designated to make the school accessible, but the difference between the street level and the drive level kept a van from going up.
Yes.
Yeah, I can speak to that, Ron, because this was this was me that it happened to. As I said, I'm always very cognizant of where I'm going to park, how I'm going to get to a building. And when we had visited this site months before, the circle drive was not yet complete. All of the renovations to the building were not yet complete. So we had heard about this front entryway that would be made accessible, but not seen it. And so when I pulled up, it had not, the circle drive was paved and was completed, but the grade to the road had not been. And so since my van is lowered to accommodate the ramp inside, I couldn't get beyond the threshold from the road to the circle drive in order to park on it. So it's details like that I think really drive home the importance of having somebody that has a disability involved, that can provide the perspective of, this is something else to consider, or what about this? That's really critical. And so that's just, it's things like that. The smallest detail, is often overlooked because it's a small detail.
Right.
But large on impact.
Yes. And I think the owner is he was made aware of this, and that was good because we toured the facility prior to our meeting there, Eric and I both, and she was able to point out things. not that he was trying to avoid them, but wasn't aware of them. And again, I think this is where the design team really has to be on top of the project. Those little things that you don't think about all of a sudden become major obstacles. And he's working well with us now to correct these issues. And hopefully if we hold it there again in the next few years, we won't find any issues.
Hey, next question. Does the U.S. Secretary of Interior standards for the rehabilitation of historic buildings interface well with ADA?
Personally, I think they do. I think the biggest problems we had prior was more with the building code, but the the ADA standards, I think they give enough flexibility. And again, if you're doing the audit and you kind of prioritize projects and knowing that you probably can't accomplish them all, but you make a good effort, people understand that. And but working with a team with disabled people, with proper preservation architects, owner and municipalities, all working together, I think everything kind of interfaces pretty well. We're still learning, but it's come a long way in the last 15, 20 years.
Okay. Do most architecture program at the university level emphasize accessible design issues and solutions? Does every architecture student have exposure to them, or is it an optional training?
Well, I can't speak to program. I've been out of school for quite a few years now, but I know when we went to school, it's more theoretical. We didn't know building codes, and it's not until you really get into the practice that you encounter these things. I think they're a little more aware of it now. I know certain universities, University of Michigan, I think, all the schools there in Michigan, in some form or fashion, they've exposed students to these. But I think it's more practice in the field as you're doing your intern that you'll encounter these more. I see there, if I might interrupt, Sean, I think there was a question we might have missed about the waivers.
Oh, yeah. So are waivers available under both ADA and Michigan Barrier Free Code? And who decides if you get a waiver?
Well, the under Michigan Barrier Free Code, it would be the Barrier Free Design Board, and they meet, I think, on a quarterly basis in Lansing. With ADA, it's not really a waiver per se. They will decide whether the Department of Justice will decide whether your civil rights have been violated, or if anyone's civil rights have been violated. And you're not really asking for a waiver, you're more defending yourself if case is brought against you. But again, I think this is where the audit will help in that, well, we're making progress. We set about to look at everything that we don't meet under ADA, and here's our plan of action to address this. And that all helps. It goes to make things maybe a little more less punitive action.
Okay, there's a comment about the tax credit, the proposed updates to the Michigan investment tax credit. PA 343 of 2020 confirmed that costs associated with making a historic building accessible can qualify for tax credits.
That's a great point. Wonderful point. Yes.
Okay.
So that would be in addition to the historic tax or the tax credits that Erica mentioned. Those are federal. This is Michigan. So great.
Okay. Okay, and another comment, I bet that's from a lot of people that would like to say that we loved your presentation And thank you so much for your time and effort to put this together for us. This webinar is being recorded. So, and everybody will receive an email when the recording is available. It will be on our website too. So if you want to share it with people that you think would benefit from it, please feel free to share it. And we want as many people as possible to hear about this. Our next webinar is yet to be announced. Please check our website for upcoming webinars and events. And well, thank you again, Ron and Erica. And
Oh,
thank
thank
you
you.
everybody for joining us today. And I hope to see everybody next time.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.